Okay, let's get this straight from the very outset. Modern art is not the worthless garbage many uninformed and misguided people might like to think it is. In fact, when properly understood, many of the best examples of modern art are even more profound and substantial and interesting and involving than anything you can find in the classical tradition. And if you find that difficult to credit, then bear with me. So how come that modern art is so badly misunderstood and so badly served by the critics? And the answer is simple. People have not yet been able to distinguish between the logic of aesthetics, that is to say, the rationale behind the crafting of beautiful objects, and the logic of narrative content, that is to say, the presentation of objects in a narrative context and with narrative intent. So it's all down to this distinction, the distinction between the aesthetics of beauty and the logic of narrative content, and the extent to which you are able to appreciate the difference between these two very distinct intentions in presentational crafting is the extent to which you will be able to appreciate the subtleties and complexities realized in a modern art presentation. So any understanding of modern art begins with this distinction between the logic of beauty and the logic of narrative content. The popular conception of art is wholly inadequate for our purposes, but we need to take a look at it. The idea of art that we are likely to encounter in everyday life combines a number of key elements: performative excellence, creativity, and classical technique, all of which means our everyday conception of art is able to extend from moments and instances in everyday life to exhibits in a classical context. We can see art in the way someone performs tasks in a kitchen, and we can see art in classical oil paintings. So our ordinary everyday conception of art is able to extend from the utterly mundane to the classically sublime. But the crucial point about our ordinary everyday popular conception of art, the one that we learn at school and the one that we encounter in one form or another every day in the media, is that it is wholly and completely dependent on the idea that art is about aesthetic beauty. Aesthetic beauty means that the crafted material, whatever the art form, it could be music, it could be sculpture, it could be painting, it could be dance, whatever the form, is specifically designed to appeal to your senses. Aesthetic crafting is about sensual pleasure. Your sensual experience of an art object may trigger all kinds of spiritual musings, but these musings are secondary and somewhat irrelevant to the direct sensual aesthetic experience. If you took away the sensuality of aesthetic crafting, you'd be left with nothing. And we can sum up the idea of aesthetics simply by saying that aesthetic crafting is about crafting the sensually beautiful. There's no more to it than that. And this is exactly what the classical notion of art boils down to. Art, whatever the art form, is about creating and crafting classically beautiful objects. And classically beautiful objects are to be appreciated and understood according to the parameters of sensual aesthetics. But aesthetic sensuality is not the only dimension open to presentational crafting. As we've said, there's also narrative content. And narrative content extends all the way from the simple implications present in any object to the full-blown complexities of a plot-driven storyline. Films and books are dense with explicit and well-understood narrative content. But so too are everyday objects, from bicycles to knives to clothing. Every object has its own story to tell, and it is this narrative dimension to objects which is crucial to their possible exploitation and orchestration in a specifically artistic context. Now let's be very clear about narrative content insofar as it relates to specific art objects. Artistic narrative content is not simply any old idea that you can bring to an object and give it meaning. Artistic narrative content is not the same as resonances and ideas inspired by the sight of an art object. There has to be an extremely convincing connection between the art object and its narrative content if we are not to descend into the kind of speculative tripe that characterizes vast amounts of art criticism. For example, it is extremely difficult to make a convincing case about narrative content in either a Jackson Pollock or a Mark Rothko. The characteristic marks on the canvas are so abstract as to defy narrative content in anything but the most trivial sense. And this allows us to safely conclude that except for very rare instances, Robert Ryman being a case in point, the entire genre of abstract painting is entirely devoid of narrative content. Abstract art is decorative crafting, but it is not and never can be narrative art. And narrative art is the only form of real art there is. Now let me give an example of a convincing network of narrative relationships. All the works of Joseph Beuys, including performances and display objects, have a convincing narrative connection to the wider Joseph Beuys art project. Even in those many instances when it might be very difficult to articulate in any lucid way exactly what that project is. And it is part of his greatness as a modern artist that many aspects of his art defy simple articulation. You know you're in the presence of a narrative, but you find that narrative impossible to put into words. And to repeat, narrative in this context is not about resonances and interpretations and meanings plucked out of the air to afford significance to objects in some kind of open-ended interpretative way. Anyone can come up with interpretative resonances of anything, but that doesn't help us understand art. The connection between the object and the interpretation must be plain and convincing. John Lennon's bloodied spectacles are not about workers' rights in Venezuela, just as Joseph Beuys's fat chair is not a poetic meditation on bodily decay or bodily vulnerability. The fat chair brings with it its own inexplicable, impenetrable narrative, which is what makes it such a great work of modern art. Don't attempt to domesticate it with reductionistic and comforting interpretations. Leave it in all its impenetrability. So we've said that art is essentially narrative, and all other forms of presentational crafting are essentially about the aesthetics of sensual beauty. But this still doesn't really characterize art in any easily identifiable and understandable way. We've said art is not aesthetics, but what exactly is art? What kind of narrative content distinguishes art from everything else? There has to be something about art which allows us and encourages us to identify it as distinctly itself. What kind of narrative is distinctly and uniquely and characteristically artistic? In a word, it's any presentational narrative which is characteristically strange, disturbing, and unsettling. All other forms of presentational narrative are merely ordinary and don't qualify as art, no matter how magnificently and intricately crafted they may have been. So presentational narratives are either ordinary or artistic, and artistic narratives are always characteristically strange, disturbing, and unsettling. This is how you distinguish artistic presentational crafting from all other forms of presentational crafting. Now, examples of presentational craftspeople who easily qualify by our definition as artists would include names like Joseph Beuys, Francis Bacon, Gilbert and George, Cindy Sherman, Joel Peter Witkin, in that their works are easily identifiable as strange and disturbing. But there are some other names which need to go on the list, which many people might find very surprising. Andy Warhol for one, and Jeff Koons for another. But by what conceivable standard could these bright and cheery pop artists be considered strange and disturbing? Well, both have presented us with explorations of banality, superficiality, and emptiness, the like of which Samuel Beckett and Harold Pinter could only dream of. They've offered us an artistic representation of the inverse of our traditional cultural values, including optimism, commitment, profundity, and cultural classicism, and they've taught us instead how to celebrate nihilism, superficiality, and immediacy. And the important point here is you don't have to endorse or subscribe to their particular celebration to be able to enjoy it as an artistically vicarious experience. And that's another important dimension to art. Art is recreational. It's not the real thing. You experience it vicariously, in the same way that you can enjoy a film about serial killing without becoming a serial killer yourself. All art is presentational, meaning that it is presented to you for vicarious recreation. Now let's draw all these ideas together into a coherent and cogent totality. Art is a form of vicarious presentational crafting, but it has a unique and distinctive character which differentiates and separates it from all other forms of presentational material, in that art is always characteristically strange and disturbing and unsettling. Now, how could we consolidate this whole line of argument? Simply by pointing out that when it comes to vicarious recreation, there are really only two major possibilities. reassurance, or disturbance? Do you want your vicarious narratives to reassure you or to provoke you? Do you want to be shown variations of what you already know, or do you want to be offered new realms of vicarious experience? Ordinary presentational narratives will leave you where you are. Artistic narratives are portals into the unknown. Artistic narratives are provocative and disturbing and unsettling. Put slightly differently, do you want your recreational narratives to show you something new and interesting and different? Or do you want them simply to confirm what you already believe? It's the job of the artist to take you out of yourself and to lead you into the unknown. But just how practical is our new conception of art? Well, we can apply it directly and immediately to whatever we are presented with. Is this unmade bed art? Is it presenting us with a portal to a strange and disturbing narrative? No, it isn't. At best, it's directing us back to the artist, who is not orchestrating a strange and disturbing narrative. Her narrative may have its own distinctive appeal, but it is not characteristically strange and disturbing. Okay, if it's not art, what is it? It's just another example of creative crafting, and a very famous one at that, but it does not qualify by our very exacting definition as art. For art to be art, it must tell us something we don't already know. It must lead us into the realms of the strange and disturbing. It must offer us an entirely unexpected narrative. Creative crafting is beautiful and reassuring. Art is something else altogether. What about a fish in a tank? Isn't that strange and disturbing? Isn't that art? Well, not really, unless you're unfamiliar with the idea of presenting the unexpected in the name of art. Art is not about the odd or the unexpected or the unfamiliar. Art is about orchestrating strange and disturbing narratives, and this unfortunately leads us to a rather grim and disheartening conclusion. And this is that by our exacting definition, genuine art is exceedingly rare, and that most of what one is likely to encounter in the name of modern art is in fact no more than creative crafting, and wholly devoid of any narrative other than the most trivial. Yes, of course, there are dazzling installations by Yayoi Kusama, and stunning pieces by Takashi Murakami, and colors and shapes aplenty. But colors and shapes, no matter how dazzling, do not rise to the level of art. They are devoid of narrative, and can at best be appreciated for their aesthetic value. But sensual aesthetics is one thing, and art is quite another. So how come this conception of art is not more widely appreciated? Well, at least part of the reason for the persisting confusion between aesthetics and art is that modern narrative art emerged from within an aesthetic environment, and it is much easier and less demanding to apply the judgments of aesthetics to an art object than it is to make the required mental shift from an appreciation of an object as a matter of the senses to an appreciation of the object as an element in a wider narrative. Many people are either unwilling or unable to do this, and so they continue to confine their understanding of art to classical aesthetic parameters, and as a consequence judge the best of modern art as shoddy and worthless. But the ultimate justification for a conception of art of the kind that we have outlined here is that it offers a genuinely interesting and substantial dimension to any understanding of modern presentational material, and this understanding can easily hold its own against the principles of classical aesthetics. After all, which has more to it? The ability to refine and educate sensual responses, or the ability to experience and appreciate narrative realms above and beyond one's own? An exacting and focused definition of modern art, such as we have outlined here, offers any participant access to a whole range of vicarious experiences, and this is infinitely more interesting than the aesthetics of colors and shapes and sounds. The best of modern art undeniably offers us a powerful and substantial form of recreational narrative. So in the end, let's put it like this: what more could we possibly ask of modern art than that which it is already giving to us, if we can be bothered to understand it properly?